Good evening everyone, welcome to an Aussie Cyclone Chasers Cyclone video update tonight, the 4th of March 2014. My name's Chris Nitzo, and if we start tonight by letting you know that the team is now on alert for the possibility of a cyclone chase. Now, the on alert stage is the stage before we get into the planning part of the mission. So once we get into planning, we start scoping out accommodation, looking at the type of topography and the land of where the system is expected to go. But at this point in time, there's not enough evidence to suggest that this cyclone will cross the coast. So until that evidence firms up, we'll remain on the alert stage. On the alert stage, we just make sure that we have we fuel up and we have adequate supplies, and we basically are ready to go in case we then start to get into that planning phase, in case we get better guidance on the system in terms of landfall. Overall, the model guidance for the Queensland Coral Sea Tropical Low Cyclone is quite good at the moment, and it's suggesting that the system remains just offshore. Now, if it remains just offshore, the chances are we'll still chase it, because we'll still get some pretty good wind readings from it, regardless of whether it crosses or not, if it can remain within sort of that 100 kilometres off the coast region. And a lot of the model guidance has it pushing that close. Some of the model guidance has it hitting the coast. Until that guidance firms up, though, we'll remain on alert rather than the planning phase. So across the Northern Territory, we're watching a very, very weak low pressure system in the Timor Sea, and it's really not doing anything. It's just getting sheared. Every time it tries to develop some thunderstorms, it just gets sheared away. It's very hard to see on satellite there because it is so weak, and the signature associated with it is so weak. Now, some of the guidance does actually develop this system in the medium to longer term, and there's considerable doubt as to whether the system will develop here near the Northern Territory or whether the system will develop way out here in the Southern Indian Ocean. So there's a little bit of complexity and doubt between the model guidance as to whether they develop this circulation or whether they develop a new circulation in about 7 days' time well off the Pilbara coastline. Now, at this stage, most of the guidance for the upcoming Pilbara system suggests that the system will remain well and truly offshore, but it is still a long way away, and we don't want to lock that in 100%. But at this point in time, if a low does form out here in the next 7 to 10 days, it is likely to remain well offshore, according to pretty well all the ensemble guidance that we have access to at this point. Now, we'll talk a bit more about that if it starts to show signs of actually happening. So at the moment, we've just got a very weak low in the vicinity there. Alright, over the rest of the continent and into the Coral Sea, we see continuation of good thunderstorm activity over inland NT associated with this trough system, and this trough system not producing too much in the way of decent shower and storm activity in Queensland, but at least keeping temperatures down through some fairly cloudy conditions over the west. Now, on the Cape, we actually had some really good convergence developing here near Princess Charlotte Bay, and it was actually tricking up some of the model guidance into thinking that it was a low pressure system, and they were spinning it up out here early this morning, and so that has thrown the overall guidance of the low way out here a little bit off up until later on today, once the models realized that this wasn't a low and it was just a convergence area and treated it as such. But earlier in the day, they were developing a quick little low pressure system here and pushing it west, and because of that, they were starting to, or particularly the GFS was really struggling with the actual circulation that we're watching because it was developing multiple vortices. So now that we have dismissed that as being a low pressure system, there is, while we've dismissed it here, there is a chance that the remnants of that thunderstorm activity will push to the northwest and find themselves in a little bit more favourable conditions out here in the Arafura Sea, and they may form into a low there, and that is probably why the models are struggling so much with regards to the next WA system as to whether it's going to be an NT into WA system or whether it's going to be a whole new circulation. Alright, so that's that. Now let's look at the Coral Sea. In the past 24 hours, convection has absolutely exploded here in the northern Coral Sea, and we're seeing some very, very deep thunderstorm activity just to the north of where the low pressure system is centered, as in just to the north, probably about less than 100 k's to the north. But you can really see the monsoon trough here, the convergence associated with the monsoon trough right in through here, just a big line of it. just in through this region here. You can see just a big line of activity there, so it's very clear to see where things will develop on that trough line. And that just continues all the way east into Fiji, past the date line in fact, so it's just a massive area of activity there in the Western Pacific. It's just an absolutely just raging monsoon out there. On microwave imagery, it is hard to see, but the low pressure center is possibly located in this area here. It is very difficult to see though. It is remarkably weak still, and that was as of about 6 hours ago, located right around that 10 south 155, maybe just a little bit west of where I've pointed there. But it's so weak that it's so difficult to pinpoint the center at this point in time. So that's where Sims has it as well. We see the centre right there at around about 155 or 156 east, about 10 south. That's where the pinpoint of the centre of circulation is. But once again, you can see very weak winds up here, 5 knots to its north. Some pretty decent winds to its south, around 20 to 25 knot maximums. But really overall, it still remains a fairly weak circulation at this point in time. Remember, we're getting into that nighttime period. In the nighttime period, we'll see convection increasing. We are already seeing really good convection, so it doesn't really have to increase by much to see a deepening of the system. We just need to see that convection consolidating around the centre. So just to digress slightly from what we're talking about, just in one of the visible imageries this afternoon, we actually saw a very weak little eddy or circulation developing a lot closer to the Queensland coast. This is the 150 line here, and the Queensland coast is just off your screen to the left, and that's the 15 degree south line. So there is a little weak eddy here that's developed, but no real convection associated with the system. The convection's displaced about 200 k's away, but still it's very interesting to see a high-res image of a very weak circulation that developed near the monsoon. So why have we seen such an increase in thunderstorms located in and around the center of the circulation? Well, this is a pretty good image here of the wind shear associated right over the top of the system. And we see that today we had a dramatic drop in wind shear down to about 10 knots. It's been up around 20 knots, even a little bit more than that over the past couple of days. But really just in the last sort of 6 to 12 hours, we've seen a decrease in wind shear down to that 10 to 15 knot mark. So we are likely to continue to see a decrease in shear conditions now as the system tracks southwards. It's just a matter of consolidating the centre. So for those of you that have been following our updates, it comes as no surprise that we're now expecting this system to form into a tropical cyclone later in the week or very early in the weekend. So the Bureau of Meteorology have upgraded the system to a high, which is 50% plus chance of developing into a TC on the Friday. They do expect it to move towards the coast, and now let's have a look at all the model guidance associated with that. So we'll start by taking a look at the access model. We can see the low pressure system here into tomorrow. It doesn't really do much, but as we head towards Thursday, it does start to deepen and start to tighten up, and you can see it here as it tracks in a south to southwest direction closer to the Queensland coast. It's located near 150 east at about 16 south Friday evening. So it really does not do much tomorrow, but on Thursday it starts to deepen, and on Friday it gets very close to being ATC. So let's have a look at what that equates to in terms of wind. So what you're looking at here is rainfalls. So what you were looking at just before was rainfall over that 3-hour period. What you're looking at, or what you're about to be seeing here, is going to be winds, or are going to be winds over the next 3 days. So at 4 PM today, there's our system, probably initialized just a little bit too far to the west, but really pretty close, and let's not argue about it. As we head to tomorrow, nothing really happens here. The system remains fairly elongated, so you can see here it's an oval shape instead of a circle shape. And as we head to Thursday, we see the system tightening up, and we actually start to see 25 to 35 knot winds in and around the system on the eastern and southern quadrants, or southern semicircle and eastern semicircle. And then as we head to Friday, we actually start to see some gales developing around developing in parts of the system. So this south or southwestern quadrant of the system develops 34 to 48 knot winds, and we're starting to see some of those really strong winds developing and hitting the offshore regions of the Queensland coastline from about Rocky north to about just south of Cairns. So we're starting to see those 25 to 35 knot winds just on the offshore waters there. So if we take a look now at some of the other model guidances, this is the UKMet model. Now the UKMet model really has the system not getting too close to the Queensland coast, really not beneficial for anyone involved with this situation. It's not going to produce any type of meaningful rainfall on the coast if it follows this track, and really it's only going to produce some pretty decent swells for southeast Queensland, and that's pretty much the surfers are going to be the only benefiters of this particular track. So you can see here pushes south and then pretty well southeast or even east by the end of the forecast period. Also interesting to note that the UKMet on about days 4 and 5 develops that low pressure system out here in the Arafura or Timor Sea, I should say, and pushes it in a very slow westerly motion. So that's something to also note, that the UKMet is doing that others aren't. Now, the experimental FIM8 30km resolution model suggests that the system tracks a little bit closer to the Queensland coast, but still not close enough to give any meaningful rain to any part of the coastline. And once again, the system tracks almost due south all the way to about 20 degrees south, and then stalls in here in the southern Coral Sea or the central Coral Sea. The other thing that this model has is that, remember that little eddy or that little weak low that we talked about in that visible imagery earlier in the broadcast? It actually develops that and pushes it initially westwards, and then sort of merges it with another thunderstorm cluster here on about day 3, and pushes it back towards the southeast and over the Cape. So I think it's getting a little bit confused there with a couple of different vortices, a couple of different circulations. The FIM9 model is a little bit higher resolution, and we see a very similar track, which is pretty understandable because they both follow the same set of physical algorithms. Once again, with this model, it remains too far offshore for the system to create any meaningful weather for the Queensland coastline. With this one, we might see some isolated showers on the coast, but nothing more than that. The NavGem model doesn't want a bar of anything over Queensland from this particular system. It just wants to track it south-southeast and into the southwest Pacific. Look, we find that quite unusual, and we don't think that that's quite going to happen. But the NoGAPS model the NavGem model is also developing. Remember that weak eddy again? It's developing that into a tropical low and pushing it onto the Cape. So once again, the multiple circulations here are confusing the NoGAPS or NavGem model. This is the European model, and we'll talk about this one in a little bit more depth and detail very shortly, but this is its forecast track. So you can see here the system pushes southwest and then eventually pushes in a more southerly direction over the next 5 days. At day 5, it lies just off the coast of Townsville to Bowen. And the other interesting thing with the Euro is it does form a weak circulation in the far northwestern Gulf of Carpentaria, and also possibly a very weak circulation well off the Kimberley coastline on day 5. The Canadian CMC model is notorious for developing multiple circulations that don't exist, so let's focus on the one that does exist, and it does push this in a south-southwesterly direction over the 5-day period, and still remaining offshore, but remaining close enough to the coast on the CMC that it's creating a fair amount of shower and possibly rain activity along the central and southeast, even southeast Queensland coastline. Now, be aware that the CMC is likely being thrown off the scent because of multiple circulations in and around the major or the primary circulation. So just be aware that this could be riddled with errors based on the fact that it's developing 1, 2, 3, and just to the east off your screen there's the 4th one there. So 4 circulations in the space of about 1,200 kilometers is bound to play havoc with the physics that the model is showing. And finally, the GFS model has come on board and has stopped trying to push this thing on the Northern Cape York Peninsula, and it's actually going a step further and nailing the Queensland coast with it right around Townsville. So really the GFS model is the only deterministic model that is showing landfall of this tropical cyclone. So at this point in time, that's why I mentioned when we're talking about Oz cyclone chasers, we're only going on alert, we're not going into the planning phase, because we really need to see some more guidance suggesting a landfall. The European gets very, very close, but the GFS is the only model that actually shows landfall of a cyclone at this early stage. And if we take a look at a higher resolution version of that, we see that the GFS, this is the latest run from 4 PM today. This is the earlier run from earlier today, and we see that the GFS once again is the only system that actually has this making landfall. On the earlier run, it had it making landfall Sunday morning around Townsville. On this later run, it has it actually hitting the coast, same sort of area, maybe just to the north, but a little bit earlier in the night. So Saturday night, we see the system once again right over the top of Townsville. Look, once again, folks, do take this with a little bit of caution, because it is currently the only deterministic model in the entire model suite that is pushing the system onshore. And judging by the GFS's track record for the past couple of days, with it chopping and changing about 500 to 800 kilometres with each run, we really need to see a bit more certainty from this model before we start to put too much emphasis on it. But look, regardless, if this actually does come about, we are going to see one very, very wild and woolly NRL game in Townsville. Let me assure you, I don't think in the history of NRL have we ever seen a game that took place while under cyclone warning or while in and around a cyclone. So it could be a landmark occasion here. So this is Saturday, 1 PM, 4 PM, 7 PM. You can see gale force winds all around Townsville, so it should make for one interesting rugby league game. Now, if we compare that to the latest run of the European on Saturday at 10 PM, we see the system remains still a long way offshore to the east of Cairns. As we head to Sunday 1 AM, we see the system tracking in basically a due south to southwest direction. As we head to Sunday 7 AM, 10 AM on Sunday, we actually see the system really starting to develop some pretty decent gales to its south, and then as we head to 1 PM, it continues to track south and then finally just stalls right over the Queensland coastline, or just next to the Queensland coastline. Now, in that situation, while it's stalling, at that same time it is dumping copious amounts of rainfall on the coast to its south, so particularly on the Central Coast and Whitsunday coastline, and the Herbert and Lower Burdekin, particularly the Burdekin coastline, is seeing some very, very heavy falls, and those falls just continue to remain in the area. So you can see this red is extreme rainfall, and that just continues to stay in the same spot right along that central coastline throughout the Sunday, Monday period. And even as we head to Tuesday, there's still some decent rain going in that region. So look, if this sort of track eventuates, we could be seeing some massive rainfall totals in the Central Coast Whitsundays and the Burdekin region. But once again, remembering that there's still so much variation in the guidance, not so much in terms of its overall track, but just in terms of how close to the coast it gets. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about steering mechanisms tonight, because we've talked about that ad nauseum for the last couple of nights. What I do want to check though is what the environmental conditions in and around the system are likely to be as we head to different stages of its development. So firstly, let's take a look at what it's like now. So here's our system in and around this area. So if we look at the circulation to make sure I'm not leading you astray, you'll see the system located just a little bit further to the north, and you'll see that associated with it right now in terms of wind shear. Remember, with wind shear, when we look at these charts, we want the reds and the purples and the maroons. If we get those, we're in really good conditions for further development. If we don't get those and we get the blues, we're in okay conditions, and if we get the greens, yellows and oranges, forget it. So at this point in time, the system lies in pretty good wind shear, and I showed you the wind shear graph showing us that wind shear has dropped dramatically over the last 24 hours in that region. So no no doubt about it, it's starting to lie in some pretty decent conditions. The other thing we look for when we're talking cyclones is the amount of moisture in the mid-levels of the atmosphere, and that looks pretty good too. So really the issue, I guess, at the moment is it's not a very tight system, and I showed you that in the satellite winds. It's only got 5 knots to its north. It's really a very weak circulation, so it's going to take tonight to get itself together, and hopefully tomorrow things don't get too bad for it, so it doesn't destroy the structure it might develop tonight. So let's have a look at what tomorrow night has in store. So firstly, once again, we'll just take a look to make sure we've got the circulation right. There it is in the Solomon Sea, or the far northern Coral Sea. And if we look at the wind shear values around it, very, very little wind shear. It's almost in perfect wind shear conditions tomorrow night. And if we then also take a look at the relative humidity values in the mid-levels of the atmosphere, we can see a lot of dry air here in the southern central Coral Sea, but really in and around the circulation, it's very nice. So as we head to Thursday night, still no rapid development of the system, and that's pretty good. That's a pretty good sign. If we get rapid development of the system will remain well offshore. So if it takes a little while to get itself going, the chances are it'll push a little further to the west. So Thursday night, there's our circulation. Let's take a look at shear conditions. Conditions on Thursday night for the system remain extremely positive, extremely favourable, and the humidity values in the mid-levels of the atmosphere remain fairly positive. There is that dry air here, but it's still attached to the monsoon, and so it's still attached to a very nice, very strong advection of warm, moist air into the system in the mid-levels. Eventually the system does tighten up on the Friday night, and we see the system located here off the coast of Cooktown. And if we look at wind shear conditions there on the Friday night, we see that overall conditions remain extremely favourable, but there is this little pocket of wind shear to the west here, and we will have to monitor that to see if that actually comes through or whether that might be an error in the model guidance. But overall shear remains very favourable, and once again the humidity values, which are an issue as we head further to the west, but once again you see that the system is still attached to that monsoon, so it's still getting a nice feed of warm, moist air in the mid-levels of the atmosphere, or particularly moist, not so much warm, but moist air in the mid-levels of the atmosphere. And then on Saturday it develops, and develops pretty reasonably or reasonably rapidly, particularly to its south in the pressure gradient squeeze. And we have a look at the conditions in and around the system there. We have relative humidity values. We do have a little bit of dry air trying to wrap in around it, but still attached to a very moist air, very moist tongue of air coming in from and along the monsoon. And if we have a look at the wind shear values at the time in that region, we see that once again it's really got low to moderate wind shear, so it's really favourable conditions all the way through to about east of Cairns. Now I guess the issue becomes what happens later on once we get past Saturday night, because you can see out here we've got some very high values of wind shear, and if they start to impact the system, we may see the system not make it into the intensity that it could do potentially based on current guidance. So as we head to say the Sunday night, and we look at the system approaching landfall here in the Townsville to Mackay region, we see the wind shear values do tend to increase in that area. And we can see that even though the system itself, the centre of the system, lies above or below decent wind shear, just to the west here is some really, really intense wind shear values. So if it pushes anywhere further west, it just gets sheared away and will die. And also if we look at the amount of moisture in the atmosphere there, we can still see this very dry air, but it's not managing to wrap around because it's still attached to very warm, moist influx or advection of, not warm again, but moist advection of some really nice air for its development in the mid-levels. So folks, really this system should be this cyclone or low should be all systems go. So tonight's probabilities for our nutshell stuff is going to show that the system is very likely to become a tropical cyclone based on that guidance. I mean, there's really nothing that could stop it based on those shear values, humidity values, and the development of an upper level trough to its south. Should see an outflow channel develop as well for its upper level cloud. So folks, there's really nothing to stop this from actually forming into into something quite significant. We're talking at this stage, most of the guidance category 2 intensities in and around the time it gets towards the either a coastal crossing or around that 19 or 20 degrees south mark. Most of the guidance suggesting category 2 intensity system. Just a quick look at the model spread, which shows us on the Euro that there's not that much of a spread here at day 4. So Saturday morning we see the system is very likely to be located right where my cursor is. As we head to Sunday morning, the system there is a little bit more spread on Sunday morning, and that's with regards to whether the system makes landfall here in the Townsville to Mackay region or remains just offshore. And once again, that plays a massive role in how much rain gets put onto the coast. And there's even that slight chance that the system could lie further to the west and actually make landfall. There is that chance. And then as we head to Monday, we actually start to see the probability of it making landfall decreasing as the system starts to push overall to the east, and on Tuesday that easterly movement continues. Pretty similar scenario here on the GFS, although the model spread on the GFS is a little larger. You can see that the system could have already made landfall around Cairns all the way through to making landfall around Bowen, but it could also be located well and truly offshore here. So there is still a little bit more spread in the GFS guidance, and that's to Saturday. And then to Sunday, very similar. A very similar trend here where the system could be located more than likely just offshore, but also, as I said, could have already made landfall on the Saturday as well, or the Sunday in this area here. So really, folks, we're really looking at the area south of Cairns now as being the most heavily impacted from this system, and particularly the area south of Townsville to be the most heavily rain impacted area. But once again, it all depends on how close this system gets. At the moment, the models are sort of within about 500 kilometres of each other at this point in time, but 500 kilometres out here makes a big difference compared to 500 kilometres in here. So if we obviously get the western edge of that, the western outliers, we're going to see a system that makes landfall and is quite slow moving once it makes landfall, or we could see the system well and truly out here in the Coral Sea and minimal impacts except for the surfers. So really there is still a very large guidance error, but overall the track we are pretty confident in at this point in time. So that's all we have time for tonight. Once again, we didn't go through the steering mechanisms. We've been through that. Nothing's changed with those. We'll talk again tomorrow night as things hopefully start to become a little clearer. So hopefully instead of a 500 kilometre error margin, tomorrow we might have only a 400 or 300 kilometre error margin. So that's the sort of thing we're looking for. Alright folks, thanks for watching. We'll talk tomorrow. Good night.